September the 26th, 1944. London was unusually quiet. The war had taught the city how to hold its breath. The blackout curtains were drawn tight, the streets damp from a cold autumn rain, the air heavy with exhaustion that no victory headline could erase. Winston Churchill had returned only hours earlier from the Second Quebec Conference with Franklin Roosevelt. The journey across the Atlantic had drained him, but it was not travel fatigue that weighed on his shoulders. It was the knowledge that the war, which had seemed on the verge of resolution just weeks earlier, was slipping back into uncertainty. In his study at 10 Downing Street, surrounded by maps, cigars, and the accumulated paperwork of a nation fighting for its future, Churchill opened a telegram delivered moments before. It came from Field Marshal Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff. The message was short, almost brutally so. Operation Market Garden had failed. The British first. Airborne Division had been effectively destroyed at Arnhem. More than 8,000 British casualties. The bridge across the Rhine, the bridge that was supposed to end the war, had not been taken. Churchill read the message once, then again. He placed the paper carefully on his desk, as though sudden movement might make the words worse. He poured himself a glass of whiskey. This was not a moment for anger. Anger would come later. This was the moment of calculation. He understood immediately what this failure meant. The American press would demand accountability. Eisenhower would expect explanations. Congress would ask why American airborne divisions had been placed under British command for an operation that had ended in disaster. And Churchill, more than anyone else, knew that the spotlight would not remain fixed on Arnhem. It would move inevitably toward the man who had designed the operation and promised triumph. Bernard Montgomery. The real question facing Churchill was not whether Montgomery had failed. That was already beyond dispute. The question was whether Britain could survive the consequences of admitting it. Montgomery was not merely another general. He was Britain's last untouchable military figure, the victor of Alamein, the man who had restored confidence when confidence had been almost completely extinguished. To remove him would be to tell the British public that their greatest living hero had gambled recklessly and lost. It would mean acknowledging that British military judgment was no longer superior, no longer reliable, and perhaps no longer equal to that of its American allies. With a general election approaching, with the Labour Party steadily gaining ground, and with Britain's position in the world already weakening, Churchill knew that firing Montgomery might be politically fatal. So in that quiet room, with the telegram still resting on his desk, Churchill made a decision that would shape the final phase of the war in Europe. Montgomery would be defended, no matter the cost. To understand why this decision felt unavoidable, one had to understand what Montgomery represented to Britain. By the autumn of 1942, the British Empire had been fighting for survival for 3 exhausting years. Norway had been lost. France had collapsed in a matter of weeks. Greece and Crete had fallen. Singapore had surrendered in what many considered the greatest humiliation in British military history. The British Army had become associated not with victory, but with evacuation. Dunkirk had been a miracle, but it was still a retreat. The public was rationed, bombed, and deeply uncertain whether Britain could actually win the war. Then came North Africa. When Montgomery assumed command of the 8th Army, he inherited a force battered by defeat and low morale. On October the 23rd, 1942, he launched a massive offensive against Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps at El Alamein. The battle was brutal and costly, but it ended with something Britain had not experienced in years: a clear, undeniable victory against German forces. Rommel retreated. The myth of German invincibility cracked. Churchill ordered church bells rung across Britain for the first time since the war began. The sound carried far beyond celebration. It carried relief. Within weeks, Montgomery became a household name. At the Lord Mayor's luncheon in November, Churchill delivered one of his most famous lines, declaring that this was not the end, nor even the beginning of the end, but perhaps the end of the beginning. The British press seized on Montgomery as the embodiment of that turning point. His beret, with its twin badges, became iconic. His careful planning was praised as disciplined British professionalism. Where other generals had failed, Montgomery had succeeded. That narrative took hold with extraordinary force. Montgomery understood the value of this image and cultivated it deliberately. He granted interviews. He ensured photographers were present when he addressed troops. He spoke in confident, absolute terms. By 1943, Montgomery was no longer just a commander. He was a symbol. To a war-weary nation, he represented proof that Britain could still defeat Germany on the battlefield. Churchill, a politician long before he was a war leader, understood exactly how valuable that symbol was. Public support was as vital as ammunition, and Montgomery sustained that support. By 1944, however, the political ground beneath Churchill was shifting. The Conservative Party had governed Britain since the early 1930s, but the war had changed the electorate. Polls showed Labour gaining strength. The public wanted reform, security, and a future that went beyond victory parades. Churchill's personal popularity remained high, but his government's position was increasingly fragile. One of the few unquestioned strengths he could still claim was military leadership. Montgomery was central to that claim. If Churchill dismissed him, the political consequences would be immediate and severe. Labour would argue that Britain's greatest general had been sacrificed to appease American opinion, that Britain's prestige had been traded away, that the alliance with the United States was unequal and humiliating. Churchill could not allow that argument to take hold. There was also a deeper concern. Britain's position as a global power was eroding. The United States and the Soviet Union were now the dominant military forces. Britain's contribution to the Western Front was shrinking by comparison. Montgomery's prominence helped maintain the illusion of equality within the Allied coalition. British newspapers still spoke of partnership between equals. Montgomery commanded the 21st Army Group. Eisenhower commanded the alliance. As long as Montgomery stood unchallenged, Britain could pretend its military influence remained intact. To admit Montgomery's failure would be to admit Britain's decline. Churchill understood this reality privately, but he refused to acknowledge it publicly. It was against this backdrop that Operation Market Garden was conceived. By September of 1944, Allied armies had broken out of Normandy and were advancing rapidly across France. German resistance appeared disorganized. The end of the war seemed close. Montgomery saw an opportunity not just to win, but to dominate the final chapter of the conflict. He proposed a daring plan to leap across the Rhine and drive straight into Germany. 3 airborne divisions would be dropped deep behind enemy lines in the Netherlands, seizing bridges and creating a corridor for British armored forces. Montgomery promised that this single operation could end the war by Christmas. Eisenhower had serious doubts. Intelligence reports suggested stronger German forces in the area than Montgomery admitted. The plan required flawless execution. If even one bridge failed to be captured, the entire operation would collapse. But Montgomery applied relentless pressure. He argued that boldness was necessary, that caution would prolong the war unnecessarily. Eisenhower also faced pressure from Washington. The airborne forces stationed in Britain had yet to be used on a large scale. If the war ended without their deployment, questions would follow. Reluctantly, Eisenhower approved the operation. The decision had enormous consequences. Supplies were diverted from American advances to support Market Garden. 3 American airborne divisions were placed under British command. The Allied Air Force was concentrated almost entirely on the operation. Most critically, Montgomery postponed clearing the Scheldt estuary, leaving the port of Antwerp unusable. Without Antwerp, Allied supply lines stretched all the way back to Normandy. Fuel and ammunition were already scarce. Montgomery insisted this sacrifice would be justified. Market Garden would vindicate his strategic vision. It would prove that a British-led thrust could end the war faster than the American broad front approach. He was wagering Britain's remaining military prestige on a plan that allowed no margin for error. The operation began in mid-September 1944. Within hours, the warning signs were unmistakable. Airborne troops were dropped miles from their objectives. German resistance was far stronger than anticipated. Communication systems failed. At Arnhem, British paratroopers fought with extraordinary determination, holding the northern end of the bridge against overwhelming odds. Ammunition dwindled. Medical supplies ran out. German tanks closed in. The ground forces advancing along a single narrow highway were slowed repeatedly by ambushes and congestion. Speed was essential. Speed proved impossible. As days passed, the situation grew desperate. The entire operation hinged on reaching Arnhem in time. It did not happen. By the time evacuation was ordered, only a fraction of the British 1st Airborne Division escaped. Thousands were killed or captured. Allied casualties exceeded 17,000. The Rhine remained uncrossed. The war did not end by Christmas. Market Garden had failed completely. German commanders were later astonished by the operation's ambition and bewildered by its execution. They could not understand why airborne troops had been dropped so far from their targets, or why the advance relied on a single exposed road. Market Garden revealed something deeply unsettling. Montgomery's reputation for caution masked a willingness to gamble recklessly when his prestige was at stake. The defeat was not partial, it was total. Montgomery refused responsibility. He blamed the weather for delayed air support. He blamed intelligence failures. He blamed supply shortages. He blamed anyone except himself. What he did not acknowledge was that the plan itself had been fundamentally flawed. Within days, he was demanding priority for new operations and additional American divisions. He claimed Market Garden had been largely successful. He believed it. Churchill's private reaction was fury. Alan Brooke recorded that the Prime Minister was incandescent when he grasped the scale of the disaster. Churchill had personally championed the plan. He had argued that British forces deserved the chance to deliver the decisive blow. Now, thousands of British paratroopers were gone for nothing. Yet Brooke warned him that removing Montgomery would be political suicide. The public still believed the operation had nearly succeeded. The press had not yet turned. Churchill faced a choice between truth and survival. He chose survival. Churchill knew that once the truth escaped into public view, it could not be pulled back. So he moved fast. In early October 1944, he stood before the House of Commons and spoke about Operation Market Garden. His words were carefully chosen. He praised courage. He honored sacrifice. He spoke of bridges taken and ground briefly held. What he did not say mattered more than what he did. He did not admit that the Rhine had not been crossed. He did not acknowledge that the operation's central objective had failed. And he did not criticize Bernard Montgomery. Instead, he framed the operation as a bold attempt that had nearly succeeded. A gallant gamble, not a catastrophic miscalculation. The British press followed his lead without hesitation. Newspapers presented Market Garden as a near victory. Arnhem became a story of heroism rather than error. Montgomery's reputation remained intact. The public never saw the full cost laid bare. Across the Atlantic, however, the reaction was very different. American newspapers described the operation as a costly failure. They questioned why American airborne divisions had been placed under British command, and why so many lives had been spent for nothing. Churchill noticed the growing divide and accepted it. British political survival mattered more than American approval. The consequences of Market Garden were not immediate, but they were severe. The supplies poured into the operation had been diverted from other advances, particularly from Patton's Third Army. In September 1944, Patton's forces had been advancing at astonishing speed and were approaching the German frontier. But fuel and ammunition were limited. Eisenhower gave Montgomery priority. Patton's advance slowed, then stopped. The pause gave German forces precious time to recover. By December 1944, that time had been used well. German units had rebuilt their defenses and prepared a counteroffensive. When the attack erupted in the Ardennes, American forces were caught off guard. Entire units were surrounded. Soldiers froze in foxholes. Casualties mounted into the tens of thousands. The Battle of the Bulge was not an accident. It was the result of a delay that had allowed Germany to regroup. The crisis deepened when Eisenhower temporarily placed American forces north of the Bulge under Montgomery's command for coordination. Montgomery interpreted the decision as validation. After the fighting subsided, he held a press conference and spoke as though British leadership had rescued a collapsing front. American commanders were furious. Bradley and Patton demanded action. Eisenhower drafted an order to remove Montgomery from command. Churchill intervened once more. He understood that if Montgomery were fired, the political damage at home would be devastating. He pleaded with Eisenhower to delay and promised an apology. Montgomery's statement admitted nothing and changed nothing, but it was enough to save his position. The alliance, however, was permanently damaged. Trust was gone. Churchill knew it. Yet he also knew he had no alternative. British politics had again overridden military truth, and the cost had already been paid by men who would never hear the speeches that justified their loss. By early 1945, the damage could no longer be hidden behind speeches or communiques. The war in Europe was nearing its end, but the alliance that had carried it this far was fractured beneath the surface. American commanders no longer trusted Bernard Montgomery. They questioned every proposal, challenged every request for resources, and resisted serving under his authority whenever possible. The smooth cooperation that had once defined Allied command was gone. Montgomery himself seemed oblivious. He believed his reputation remained intact, that history would vindicate him, and that criticism was merely the product of wounded pride. He never understood that trust, once broken, does not return. Churchill understood far more than he admitted publicly. In private conversations, he acknowledged that Montgomery had become dangerously arrogant, that his judgment was clouded by celebrity, and that his failures had prolonged the war and cost lives. But Churchill also knew Britain was exhausted. Its manpower was stretched to the limit. Its economy was shattered. Its empire was fading. Montgomery was one of the last remaining symbols of British military greatness. To sacrifice him would be to confirm what Churchill feared most, that Britain was no longer a first-rank power. So he continued to defend Montgomery, not because he believed in him, but because he believed Britain could not endure the truth. Germany surrendered in the spring of 1945. The guns fell silent. The photographs were taken. Montgomery accepted the surrender of German forces in his sector and posed for the cameras as one of the architects of victory. British newspapers celebrated him. Churchill praised his leadership in Parliament. To the British public, the narrative remained intact. Montgomery was a hero. Market Garden became a tragic but gallant episode. The deeper consequences were quietly ignored. Across the Atlantic, the mood was very different. American commanders watched the celebrations with bitterness. They remembered Arnhem. They remembered the months of delay that had allowed the Ardennes offensive to happen. They remembered the soldiers who froze and died because resources had been wasted on a failed gamble. Eisenhower's private assessment of Montgomery was devastating. He described him as a narrow, canalized strategist, incapable of seeing beyond his own sector. Bradley was more blunt, calling Montgomery the most overrated general in Europe, a man whose reputation rested on a single victory and relentless self-promotion. Patton's judgment was harsher still. He believed Montgomery's incompetence had cost thousands of American lives, and that Churchill's political protection of him had betrayed the alliance. The numbers supported those judgments. The destruction of the British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem, the strategic pause that enabled Germany's final offensive, the extended fighting in the Netherlands that achieved nothing decisive. These were not abstract failures. They were measured in graves. In the summer of 1945, British voters delivered their verdict. Churchill, the man who had led Britain through its darkest hours, was swept from office in a landslide. The Labour Party won decisively. Clement Attlee became Prime Minister. Churchill's protection of Montgomery had not saved his political career. It had only damaged relations with Britain's most powerful ally. Coalition warfare forces leaders to make choices that pure military logic would never justify. When political survival is at stake, truth becomes negotiable. Reputations are preserved. Failures are reframed. Memoirs are written. But the soldiers who paid the price for those decisions do not get to explain what those calculations cost. They do not write history. They lie beneath it.